Welcome to this presentation on the women's suffrage movement in Colorado and recent efforts to identify and designate sites associated with it. Over the next 35 slides, we will provide background on this project, discuss 6 suffrage properties researched and surveyed, the results of that work, and how you can participate in identifying more women's suffrage sites going forward. This project was funded by an underrepresented communities grant from the National Park Service's Historic Preservation Fund, which provides financial support to state, tribal, local, and nonprofit organizations. The grant was awarded to History Colorado and was administered and overseen by the Colorado Historical Foundation. The foundation mobilizes resources to support Colorado's people in their efforts to preserve meaningful places, heritage, and history. To date, conservation easements donated to the foundation have protected 118 historic places statewide. Additionally, the foundation finances historic building rehabilitation and manages a variety of strategic funds and projects. This project, associated with women's suffrage, is one of 3 spearheaded by the foundation to document sites associated with underrepresented communities in the state. Other recently completed projects focused on sites associated with LGBTQ history and travel and leisure places welcoming to Black travelers during the Jim Crow era. To complete the work for this women's suffrage project, the foundation hired myself, Erica Warzel of Clear Story Preservation, and my colleague Amy Unger of Pine Street Preservation, who will also be presenting. Both Clear Story and Pine Street Preservation are independent preservation consulting firms based in Colorado, and we researched and evaluated the selected historic sites for this project. Although funded by an underrepresented communities grant, any opinions, findings, and conclusions or recommendations expressed in this material are those of the authors and do not necessarily reflect views of the National Park Service or the Department of the Interior. In 2021, a survey plan for women's suffrage sites in Colorado was completed by Clear Story Preservation. This plan, funded by a grant from History Colorado to the Colorado Historical Foundation, provided a history or context of the women's suffrage movement in the state and identified types of properties that reflect that history. It also provided several examples of suffrage sites across the state and gave recommendations on next steps. The project we are discussing today fulfilled one of the primary recommendations to research, evaluate, and survey 6 selected properties associated with the suffrage movement and nominate 3 of them to the National Register of Historic Places. The fight to gain voting rights for women in Colorado spanned several decades. The context provided in the survey plan divides the history of women's suffrage in the state into 5 different eras and provides a detailed history, which we will briefly summarize here. After national efforts for women's suffrage failed in the 1860s and 70s, the expansion of Western territories in the U.S. and their formation into states proved an important way for the movement to finally gain momentum. Colorado was one such territory where women's suffrage was considered as it bid to become a state. The cause repeatedly suffered defeats. Ultimately, the state's 1876 Constitution required that its all-male electorate approve equal voting rights for women at some future date by public referendum. After an unsuccessful campaign during the state's first election in 1877 to do just that, the movement lay dormant in Colorado for many years. A renewed interest in the cause was catalyzed in 1890 by another swath of Western territories seeking statehood and considering whether to include full voting rights for women in their state constitutions. As a result, Colorado's Equal Suffrage Association reorganized and began a new push for women's suffrage to be considered by public referendum. One important partner was the Women's Christian Temperance Union, or WCTU, a women's organization formed in 1874 in Ohio that was devoted to the prohibition of alcohol, which its members saw as a primary cause of domestic abuse, poverty, and the disintegration of the family. Over time, the WCTU aligned itself with women's suffrage, which was seen as the only way prohibition could be enacted. The Colorado WCTU, the state's largest and most active women's organization, was formed in 1880 with the explicit goal of building support for women gaining the vote. As a result, many towns in Colorado formed local chapters in the 1880s, and the temperance movement became nearly synonymous with the women's suffrage movement. With the Populist Party's sweep of state offices in 1892 and the support of the state WCTU, conditions appeared ripe for Colorado suffragists to try for another referendum in the 1893 election. Advocates from across the region and country arrived in the state to rally people to their cause, and dozens of local suffrage leagues sprang up across the state. With these combined efforts, led by women and supported by some men, the ballot measure providing women the vote was victorious, and Colorado became the second state in which women could vote, after Wyoming included women's suffrage in its 1890 Constitution. And Colorado was the first to do so by a public referendum.
In addition to covering this history in detail, the survey plan discussed the types of places associated with the women's suffrage movement, as identified through research and an analysis of historical trends. As befitting the grassroots nature of the women's suffrage movement, the homes and workplaces of suffragists were identified as the most prominent type of site where suffrage advocacy and behind-the-scenes work took place. The survey plan included the compilation of over 400 suffragists in a database, and dozens of the most prominent across the state were further researched in an attempt to find the places associated with them and their work that are still standing. Those in the bigger cities were frequently found to have been demolished due to development and changing city patterns. Those still standing tend to be from later periods. Suffragist homes in smaller communities have proved harder to find due to a lack of exact addresses in many research resources, like censuses and city directories, but more in-depth research may uncover them. Though speaking in public remained an unusual and bold act for women in the 19th and early 20th centuries, public speeches were a preferred method for persuading the American public that women's suffrage was a public good. The sites where these speeches took place are perhaps some of the easiest to track down, since, by design, they sought to spread the word of equal suffrage far and wide. By the same virtue, they also represent a greater geographical reach across the state. Suffrage organization meeting sites, where suffrage leagues met to plan and strategize, are another important suffrage property type and frequently overlap with the public speaking property type. However, many of the most prominent examples of these sites, like where statewide suffrage conventions were held and the Denver headquarters for the Colorado Equal Suffrage Association, were demolished long ago. Others, like the National Women's Party Colorado headquarters in Colorado Springs, have been heavily altered, making it difficult to tell if it is the same building. Yet modest examples like the 8th Street Baptist Church in Pueblo, which we will discuss in greater detail later on, remain. Coalition and/or advocacy sites are where a broad range of organizations that supported suffrage were known to have met, such as the WCTU and poverty relief groups, labor groups, local chapters of the Grange, and women's clubs. These sites are most commonly associated with the 1893 referendum campaign, though earlier instances of WCTU and Grange meetings from the reorganization period, 1878 to 1892, are known to have occurred. Likewise, women's clubs continued their suffrage advocacy long after Colorado women gained the vote in an effort to bring equal suffrage to the entire country. To date, most places identified in the survey plan have been lost, except for the Loveland Opera House, where suffrage speeches as part of the Grange's Farmers Institute were given during the 1893 campaign. However, further research may reveal other surviving sites. Political action sites are a broad-ranging property type where protests and other attempts to raise public awareness occurred. Since protests and pageants did not become common until the 1910s, these sites tend to represent the later years of the suffrage movement in Colorado. The property type includes the Garden of the Gods, where a large pageant for women's equal rights was held in 1923, and the now demolished depot in Colorado Springs, where the 1916 Suffrage Flying Squadron United States train tour made a stop. This property type includes sites at which the government debated, voted upon, or enacted laws enabling women's suffrage, generally represented by only a handful of locations across the several decades of the movement. Determining where these events occurred is much more difficult for the earliest eras of the movement, when the seats of government were transitory and did not have dedicated buildings. The state capitol is the most clearly identifiable as the site where, in 1920, Colorado ratified the 19th Amendment that provided women the vote nationally. Another example is the Loveland Block in Golden, where the territorial legislature likely debated suffrage and which has been remodeled and altered many times over since the 1860s. Legacy sites are not directly associated with the suffrage movement, but have ties to suffragists who had accomplishments beyond winning the vote, such as the Denver Women's Press Club, which was founded in 1898 by prominent suffrage and journalist Minnie J. Reynolds, who coordinated purchase of the club's building in 1924.
For this second phase, following the recommendations of the survey plan, 6 historic properties associated with the struggle to gain voting rights for women in Colorado were selected for in-depth research to determine their eligibility for nomination to the National Register of Historic Places, the National Park Service's honorary designation program. The 6 sites represent 3 most common suffrage property types: homes and/or workplaces of suffragists, suffrage organization sites, and public speaking sites. The Lucy McIntyre House was constructed in 1881 for prominent Fort Collins residents Lucy N. McIntyre and her husband, Captain Josiah W. McIntyre. Born in 1844 in Pennsylvania, Lucy briefly taught school before marrying her husband. After Josiah's service in the Union Army during the Civil War, the couple ran a store in Missouri while Josiah also served as a county judge before they relocated to Colorado in 1877. Lucy McIntyre was a founding member of the Fort Collins Women's Christian Temperance Union, formed in 1880, the same year as the state WCTU. The Fort Collins Union became a particularly influential organization in the local political and social topics of the day. Lucy was elected president of the local WCTU in 1884 and frequently hosted its meetings at her home. When temperance leaders in the state embraced women's suffrage and supported the second referendum on it for the 1893 election, McIntyre also became involved with the suffrage movement. As such, her home is representative of the homes and/or workplaces of suffragists property type. As part of the local Fort Collins effort, Lucy McIntyre wrote a newspaper editorial in support of the 1893 suffrage bill, noting that, quote, "Women must live under the laws and yet have no voice in making them. This ruling is naught but the remains of ancient tyranny." In addition to her work in the temperance and suffrage movements, Lucy McIntyre also helped found several women's groups in Fort Collins. She conducted all of her known work from her home until her death in 1940. However, although she was active in the suffrage effort, McIntyre was not mentioned in an extensive account of the 1893 campaign, which named dozens of suffrage leaders across the state, and her contributions do not appear to have been as prominent as other Fort Collins women. This fact, combined with substantial changes to the house after her death, led to the conclusion that the Lucy McIntyre House is not eligible for listing in the National Register for Women's History, but is eligible for the Colorado State Register of Historic Properties, a similar honorary designation program. Another example of the homes and/or workplaces of suffragists property type is the Eliza Tanner House in Fort Collins. The home was built circa 1895 and was purchased a few years later by Elizabeth Eliza Marshall Tanner. Born in 1840 in Ohio, Eliza was an alumna of Oberlin College. She married fellow Oberlin graduate and Civil War veteran Abram Tanner in 1865. She became involved with the nascent temperance movement in Ohio and participated in a series of nonviolent protests known as the Women's Crusade of 1873 to 74. After Abram died in 1878, Eliza and her son Bert lived with her parents while she taught school, until mother and son relocated to Fort Collins in the 1880s. Though annual WCTU conventions for state and local unions were held at public spaces such as churches, regular chapter meetings were held at women's homes, usually at those who were officers. Eliza Tanner was elected president of the Fort Collins WCTU in 1892 and frequently hosted their meetings and spoke at their conventions. For the 1893 referendum on women's suffrage, Eliza became a frequent reporter of suffrage activities in the Fort Collins Courier. A week before Election Day, she wrote that, quote, "The ladies engaged in the equal suffrage campaign in the city have been very active the past month, and have succeeded in exciting a great deal of interest in the question of women's suffrage. A pretty thorough canvass of the city has been made, and there is not the least doubt in the world that a large majority of the voters of Larimer County favor granting the suffrage franchise to women." Indeed, women's suffrage enjoyed a large margin of over 68% of votes in Larimer County, helping the referendum to pass handily statewide. As national suffragist Elizabeth Cady Stanton noted in her comprehensive history of the women's suffrage movement, quote, "It is unavoidable that scores of suffragists should be omitted which are entitled to a place." Nevertheless, although detailed records of local suffrage leagues' activities and members are not known to exist today, those of the state association make clear that Eliza Tanner was an instrumental participant in Fort Collins. She is the only woman from Fort Collins named in the accounts of the 1893 campaign written by first-hand observers. An 1894 account of the campaign's success by the Rocky Mountain News lists Tanner as, quote, "among the women who took a leading part in the campaign." She continued her advocacy for women's causes by running for office, attending conventions, and hosting meetings. The Tanner House was counted as a contributing building to the Laurel School Historic District when listed in the National Register in 1980. As part of this project, it was found to be individually significant at the local level for women's history, for its direct association with the productive life of Eliza Tanner as a leading suffragist in Fort Collins during Colorado's 1893 equal suffrage campaign. Although she did not live there when working on the 1893 campaign, the house is the only identified property associated with Tanner during her life in Colorado until she died in 1938. Other sites associated with the 1893 suffrage campaign locally, such as the Fort Collins Opera House and First Christian Church, have been lost over time or significantly remodeled. Thus, the house is an excellent example of a local suffrage and temperance leader's home, where her work of organizing, letter writing, and meetings would have taken place. The Elizabeth P. Ensley House in Denver is associated with Elizabeth Piper Ensley, a Black suffragist who played an important role in Colorado's 1893 equal suffrage campaign as a founding member and treasurer of the Colorado Equal Suffrage Association. Due to Ensley's residing there, it represents the homes and/or workplaces of suffragists' property type. The women's suffrage movement has been erroneously characterized as the work of upper and middle-class women of white European American backgrounds, but women of all ethnicities and identities supported and led the cause, recognizing that democratic participation had the ability to give them an equal voice in larger society. Indeed, the women's suffrage movement was closely allied with the anti-slavery movement from its very early years, and many Black women in Colorado were directly involved in the State Suffrage Association and local chapters. Elizabeth Jane Piper Ensley was born in New Bedford, Massachusetts in 1847 to Mother Jane Gibson, a self-emancipated slave from Georgia, and Father Philip Piper, the son of freed slaves from Virginia and a mariner. Ensley went on to graduate from the West Newton English and Classical School in 1868, and then traveled in Europe, studying in Germany and Switzerland for a few years. When she returned to the U.S., she established a circulating library in Boston and worked as a school teacher in New Jersey. In 1882, she married Newell H. Ensley, a formerly enslaved Tennessean and fellow teacher. In the early 1880s, both Newell and Elizabeth were faculty members at Howard University in Washington, D.C., and then Alcorn State University, the country's first Black land-grant university located in Mississippi. In circa 1887, the couple and their young family moved to Denver. Soon after, Newell died of unknown causes, followed by the couple's infant daughter. Despite enduring these tragedies so soon after having relocated to a new city with no known sources of support, Elizabeth Ensley went on to become involved in numerous causes, most notably the campaign for women's right to vote. She was a founding member of the newly reorganized State Suffrage Association in 1890 and was elected its treasurer in 1891, a position she held for several years, most notably during the 1893 campaign, when she oversaw a large statewide effort that engaged speakers, distributed hundreds of thousands of leaflets, and relied upon thousands of volunteers. She is credited with being a leader among the state's suffragists and in the effort to engage Black men in the cause. After women's suffrage became a reality in Colorado, Ensley continued her work furthering causes especially relevant to Black women, including helping to elect Colorado's first African American state representative, Joseph H. Stewart, and founding and leading several Black women's clubs that encouraged Black women to, quote, be educated voters and to seek candidates who supported justice for Black people. Ensley lived in this house with her oldest daughter and son-in-law from 1915 until her death in 1919. Although its associations with Ensley is short and not from her most productive period, the house is the only one remaining of all her identified residences in Colorado. However, some properties might be eligible for the National Register as the only surviving property associated with a significant individual. Such a property might include a person's last home, even if most or all of her accomplishments occurred before she lived in the house. Thus, the house was found to be significant at the state level in the areas of significance of women's history and Black ethnic heritage for its direct association with the productive life of Elizabeth Ensley and her statewide influence.
Although the women's suffrage movement was led by women both nationally and in Colorado, male advocates, who typically had better access to legal and political systems, proved important allies in the decades-long struggle to obtain equal voting rights. J. Warner Mills was a particularly important male ally who not only supported the work of women within the movement, but directly worked alongside them by virtue of his legal skills. Born in Wisconsin in 1852, Mills relocated to Lake City, Colorado in 1877, where he embarked on a successful legal career, serving as a prosecutor in the Alfred Packer trials in 1883 and 1886. In Lake City, Mills involved himself in the local temperance movement and the unsuccessful 1877 women's suffrage campaign, attending a speech by acclaimed suffragist Susan B. Anthony at the Hinsdale County Courthouse and reportedly entertaining her during her visit. After moving to Denver, Mills and his family acquired this home west of City Park soon after it was built in 1892, and he immersed himself in the local temperance and suffrage movements. In addition to serving as a legal advisor to the Colorado Equal Suffrage Association, Mills wrote the legislative bill that would become the successful 1893 referendum enabling women to vote in all elections. The language of Mills's bill followed strategies established by the State Suffrage Association, including emphasizing equality over gender and stating unequivocally that every female person shall be entitled to vote in all elections in the same manner in all respects as male persons are. In the months leading up to the November 1893 election, Mills spoke frequently and convincingly in support of women's suffrage, typically in tandem with female leaders in the Denver suffrage movement. The Mills House is significant in the area of women's history for its association with J. Warner Mills and his critical role in the 1893 Colorado campaign for equal suffrage, conveying how men's support of and working within the women's suffrage movement in Colorado was an important aspect of its victory in 1893. As Mills's residence in 1893, when his most significant work within the suffrage movement occurred, The house is an example of the homes and/or workplaces of suffragist property type and is the only extant building associated with mills from this time period. Its significance is elevated to the state level due to the statewide impact Mills's legislative bill had in making Colorado the second state providing equal suffrage for women. Although Black women and men were important contributors to the cause both nationally and in the state, their roles in the suffrage movement have been frequently underrepresented in historical accounts. As the one known location in Pueblo, where a suffrage league was formed during the 1893 campaign in conjunction with the Black community, the 8th Street Baptist Church is an important example of that underrepresented history. Since 1891, the 8th Street Baptist Church has been home to one of Pueblo's oldest Black congregations. More than a place of worship, the church historically served as a meeting place for social, political, and civil rights organizations and hosted a variety of public events, including lectures, musical performances, celebrations, fundraisers, and dinners attended by Pueblo's broader community. In October 1893, leading New Mexico suffragist Mamie Marble traveled to Pueblo to speak in support of women's right to vote and the upcoming referendum in Colorado, delivering a number of speeches in various locations over 2 days. On October 10, 1893, she spoke at the 8th Street Baptist Church and organized a suffrage league at the church. It is therefore representative of both the suffrage organization meeting site and public speaking site property types. As the historically Black neighborhoods surrounding the church changed demographically in the 1960s, with an increasing number of Black residents, families, and churches moving south of the Arkansas River, 8th Street Baptist Church continued to hold services and social activities in its original location, marking the congregation's long ties to the site and neighborhood. Continuously occupied by the historical Black congregation responsible for its 1891 construction and 1908 remodeling for more than 130 years, the 8th Street Baptist Church stands as tangible evidence of the role Black churches played in the history of Pueblo and of the neighborhood that once housed the highest concentration of Black individuals and families in the city. The church was thus determined to be significant in the area of women's history as a rare local example of the connection between the women's suffrage campaign of 1893 and Pueblo's Black residents. It was also found to be significant in the areas of Black ethnic heritage and social history for its extended association with one of Pueblo's oldest Black church congregations. Throughout its history, the First Baptist Church in Salida functioned as the headquarters and meeting place for a number of community groups and frequently hosted a wide array of events and functions that played an important role in the social history of the area. After construction was completed in 1887, the church hosted lectures supporting women's causes, including talks by noted temperance leaders from across the country, such as distinguished temperance and women's suffrage advocate Frances Griffin of Alabama, and the Reverend Mary J. Borden, who took over as president of the New Mexico WCTU in 1888 and spent decades organizing white ribboners in the West. In an account of Borden's April 1893 speeches published in the Salida Mail newspaper, the local WCTU reported that Borden, quote, urged upon her hearers, as now do all of our state and national workers, the utility of the ballot box as the only practical solution of the liquor traffic, unquote. The resolution passed by the Wyoming legislature establishing women's suffrage in that state was reprinted at the end of the report with the hopes that, quote, every fair-minded man and woman may have or will read it, unquote. In advance of the November 1893 suffrage referendum, Carrie Lane Chapman, a nationally known suffragist and outstanding speaker, delivered a speech to a large audience at the First Baptist Church in September. At the close of the meeting, Chapman helped form a local equal suffrage league. The First Baptist Church served as a site for regular local suffrage meetings through the remainder of the 1893 campaign, with Chapman returning to speak at the church again in October. Chapman's speeches at the church and the actions of the local Equal Suffrage League that held its meetings there played a significant role in the success of the effort. A few months after the campaign's groundbreaking victory, prominent Colorado suffragist Ellis Meredith described Chapman's speaking tour and local organizing across the state as, quote, better than silver or gold, unquote. The combined efforts of local suffrage leagues like Salidas, state leaders, and national advocates such as Chapman ensured that Colorado women won the right to vote by a large margin. As an example of both the suffrage organization and public speaking site property types, the church reflects the local grassroots organizing and Chapman's public speaking tour that were essential to the campaign's success. The church was therefore found to be locally significant in the area of women's history as a meeting location for social reform and women's rights organizations, specifically groups associated with the temperance and suffrage movements during the late 1880s and early 1890s.
Here is a summary of our 6 survey sites findings and eligibility. After the research and survey findings of the 6 selected sites were shared with History Colorado and the National Park Service's National Register staff, the owners of the 5 National Register eligible properties were asked if they would consent to designation. The owners for the First Baptist Church, 8th Street Church, and J. Warner Mills House all gave their permission to proceed, and National Register nominations were prepared. The nominations were approved by the Colorado Historic Preservation Review Board in May 2024 and accepted by the National Park Service for listing in the National Register in July. These 3 properties are Colorado's first to be honored specifically for their associations with the state's women's suffrage movement. We are grateful to the owners of these important properties for their support. It should be noted that listing of a property in the National Register does not place any special restrictions or obligations on owners, who may alter or demolish the property subject only to local government regulations and permitting. However, listing in the National Register can provide a number of benefits, including eligibility for rehabilitation tax credits and preservation grants. The history of women's suffrage in Colorado is of interest to you, and this work has inspired you to want to contribute. We have a few ideas of how you can participate. If you are interested in researching more suffrage sites, we recommend reading through the Suffrage Survey Plan from 2021 as a great starting point to familiarize yourself with the context and people associated with the movement in Colorado. You can access the survey plan from the Colorado Historical Foundation's website, following the link we have provided in the slide.
The survey plan provides a comprehensive bibliography of both primary and secondary sources, including the 1898 History of Equal Suffrage in Colorado, written by J.G. Brown, which gives the names of dozens of suffragists who worked across the state. Other excellent resources are historic newspapers available through the Colorado State Library's digitized newspaper collection, which is easily searchable by keyword, newspaper title, date, city, and county. Seen here are articles on Martha A. Pease, president of the Colorado Equal Suffrage Association in 1893, who was featured in a February issue of the Women Voter and in a September 1932 Rocky Mountain News article celebrating her 89th birthday and discussing her advocacy for women's suffrage as a young woman. Both are available at the Colorado Historic Newspaper Collection's website, accessible via the link provided in this slide. In 1894, the Women Voter published the names of Colorado Equal Suffrage Association members associated with leagues across the state, making it a particularly valuable resource. You can attempt to track down the places where prominent suffragists lived and worked by reviewing city directories, censuses, and other public data, which can be accessed through your local library or subscription-based genealogy sites. Here we see the 1893 Denver City Directory listing Martha Pease's address and U.S. Census records indicating Pease continued to live on Ogden Street and work as a school teacher through at least 1900. Note that in smaller communities, exact addresses may not be given in these types of records, but they can provide starting points. Using a mapping tool like Google Street View can easily confirm whether the building corresponding to a found suffragist address is still standing and to what extent it has been altered. Please be sure to respect private property.
We encourage you to share your research with others. History Colorado's Office of Archaeology and Historic Preservation is a great place to start, especially as they strive to increase identification of sites associated with women and people of color, among many others. The webpage for this initiative, link provided here, includes a form in which you can share the information you have uncovered. We also encourage you to share this information with local relevant historical societies and local government preservation staff. We hope this presentation on women's suffrage sites in Colorado has been informative and inspires you to learn more about how Colorado women fought for the right to vote and where that history still resides in historic places across the state. Thank you.